Welcome, you curious learners, to Deep Dive English.
It's great to be diving in today.
Today, we're doing something a bit special. We're giving you a direct shortcut, really, a fast pass, to understanding a really pivotal book. It's called Cold Rivals, The New Era of U.S.-China Strategic Competition, edited by Evan S. Medeiros.
A truly essential read, but yeah, it's dense.
Exactly. So forget trying to wade through hundreds of pages. Think of this as your express lane. We want you to feel truly well-informed, getting those satisfying aha moments about, well, what's arguably the defining geopolitical relationship of our time.
Right.
And this deep dive, it's going to unravel the entire book for you. We'll cover everything, the history, the economics, the military side, even future scenarios.
And importantly, we'll present all the perspectives straight from the source material. The goal here is a complete unbiased picture for you.
Exactly. Knowledge unfiltered.
And it's quite a journey we're embarking on. I mean, the sheer scale of this book, and frankly, the U.S.-China relationship itself, it's just immense.
No kidding.
And you know that word competition? It gets thrown around so much, doesn't it?
All the time.
Its actual meaning can get pretty fuzzy for a lot of people.
Yeah.
This book, Cold Rivals, really steps in to try and clarify that. It aims to define and help us really understand what competition means in this specific context.
Which is so needed.
So our path through the book today is pretty logical. We'll start by trying to pin down that elusive definition of competition. What are we really talking about?
Okay.
Then we'll trace how this rivalry actually evolved historically. It didn't just appear overnight.
Right, the backstory.
Then we dive into the really powerful economic and military engines driving it all. After that, we'll explore a more subtle area, non-traditional security. Think cyber, espionage, tech transfer.
Actual stuff.
And finally, we'll look ahead, gaze into the crystal ball a bit at the possible futures outlined in the book.
And throughout all this, we're committed to impartiality, giving you all the angles.
Because that's where the real value lies, right? Understanding it from multiple perspectives.
Okay, so let's unpack this right from the beginning. The book dives straight into a really fundamental question. What does competition between the U.S. and China actually mean?
Yeah, it sounds simple, but it's really not.
Not at all. And the definition varies wildly depending on who you ask. Scholars, analysts, policymakers, they all seem to have a slightly different take.
Some see it on a spectrum, with cooperation at the other end, like you can just dial it up or down.
Right, like a volume knob.
Others see it as more of a midpoint, maybe a dangerous step towards outright confrontation. Or they even use it almost interchangeably with conflict.
And then there's the scope, isn't there? Is it just about national security, military stuff?
Or is it this really complex, interwoven thing happening across all areas, economic, technological, ideological?
That clarification right up front is so helpful, I think. It helps you, our listener, cut through those vague headlines and build a solid foundation.
Absolutely. And what's really illuminating here is how the book surveys recent research to pull out, essentially, 3 core attributes of what defines international competition. Think of these as the key ingredients.
Okay, what are they?
First, there's perceived contention. This isn't just, disagreeing politely. It's a sense of active pushback, some level of antagonism. It varies in intensity, sure, but there's that feeling the other side is actively opposing your interests.
Like a real friction.
Exactly. Second, there has to be a contest for relative power. This means at least one side, maybe both, is focused on boosting its own power or influence relative to the other. They need something to compete over. Could be territory, resources, maybe just status or influence.
Something tangible or intangible.
Right. And third, these situations usually involve either scarcity, there's not enough of the thing to go around, or a significant advantage in getting more of that thing than the rival.
So it's zero-sum, or perceived as zero-sum.
Often, yes. The book mentions a Rand report that sums it up nicely. Competition is a state of antagonistic relations short of direct armed conflict, reflecting perceived contention, an effort to gain mutual advantage, and pursuit of some outcome or good that is not generally available.
Okay.
So basically it's this shared pursuit of power, influence, prosperity, status, when the supply feels limited. And this is really different from just disagreement, which is usually more amicable, about different ways to reach a potentially shared goal. Competition has that edge of antagonism that focus on relative gains.
That's a really powerful distinction. It clarifies the landscape so much, and it highlights that this competition isn't just about the obvious stuff like military hardware or GDP figures.
Exactly. It goes into non-material things, too, like prestige, who sets the global norms, that sort of thing.
And the book emphasizes that the objectives of the competition and the tools used, economic sanctions one year, cyber attacks the next, maybe ideological arguments, they change over time, right?
Absolutely. It's a dynamic, evolving picture, not static at all.
Understanding these core ideas, contention, relative power, scarcity, gives you, listening now, a much more robust way to analyze U.S.-China relations. It lets you see beyond the, frankly, often simplistic headlines.
Definitely. It's the analytical toolkit you need.
Okay, now this next part from the book, this is where it gets really interesting. Richard Betts, in Chapter 2, makes a pretty bold comparison.
He does indeed.
He looks at today's U.S.-China relationship and compares it to the old U.S.-Soviet Cold War. He actually calls it a new Cold War.
Which is a term people debate endlessly, but Betts makes a strong case.
He does. And he argues that the similarities, perhaps surprisingly, actually outweigh the differences.
What are the key similarities he points to?
Well, first, and maybe most fundamentally, he talks about the bipolar structure of the international system. He argues, look, back then, no third power was really in the same lead as the U.S. and USSR, and today, despite other powers, he says no other state is truly in the same league as the U.S. and the PRC.
So that basic structure, two dominant players, is similar.
That's his core argument. Second, he points to concentrated stakes. Military, economic, political power, it's all highly concentrated between these two rivals, even if the mix is different today. You know, the old Cold War was ideology first, then military economics way down the list. Today, that order is scrambled.
Right. Economics is way more central now.
Exactly. Third, he sees a prolonged, dangerous rivalry. One that stops just short of direct hot war, but you've got these smoldering disputes like Taiwan and that constant shadow of hot war hanging over everything.
That feels very familiar.
And finally, he notes this really remarkable convergence of opinion in American politics on how to deal with China. Especially outside the traditional foreign policy circles, there's a strong consensus now on taking a tougher line, punishing the adversary.
That bipartisan consensus is striking.
It really is. So this whole new Cold War framing, it gives you a powerful lens right away to grasp the sheer scale and stakes of today's competition and why avoiding actual war is, right up there with climate change as a top global priority.
But if we connect that comparison to the bigger picture, the book also stresses the differences, and one stands out above all others.
Which is?
The incredible entanglement of economic and strategic interests. That's the single biggest difference from the old Cold War.
Ah, right. The U.S. and Soviets barely traded.
Exactly. Negligible economic ties. Separate worlds almost.
Yeah.
But today, U.S.-China economic interdependence is just massive. Billions, trillions of dollars. The book puts the dilemma starkly. Unwinding dependence would risk American prosperity, while not unwinding it may risk national security.
That's a heck of a bind. No easy answers there.
None at all. Then there's a whole nuclear strategy aspect. The old Cold War was defined by that constant nuclear overhang, MAD, brinkmanship, especially in Europe.
Terrifying stuff.
Today in Asia, nukes are obviously there, but that same constant day-to-day preoccupation feels like less intense. China historically had a no-first-use policy, a smaller force for minimum deterrence.
So that might be changing now.
It seems to be, which is worrying. But historically, this sometimes led to a bit of dangerous complacency, maybe on both sides, assuming any conflict could stay conventional.
What else is different?
A really unique factor today is the presence of third-party nuclear powers, especially North Korea. Their arsenal adds this incredibly volatile, unpredictable element to any crisis in the region.
Like a wild card.
A very dangerous wild card. The fear is miscalculation. North Korea thinking its nukes give it a shield for conventional aggression, like maybe Pakistan thought in the Kargil War, or like how the West is hesitant about direct engagement with Russia inside Ukraine.
But North Korea isn't the Soviet Union capability-wise.
Oh, not even close. A fraction. But still a major complicating factor.
Yeah.
Another huge difference. China's economic power relative to the U.S. is far beyond anything the Soviet Union ever achieved.
Right. The Soviets had a big military, but a shaky economy.
Precisely. This changes the game. Economic tools, leverage, competition, they're much more central to this rivalry.
And what about allies? The U.S. had NATO.
And the U.S. still has a crucial advantage there. Its strong alliance network, particularly in Asia with countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia, this provides not just military capacity, but also significant political leverage. The book notes, for instance, that Washington's influence over Japan's military posture is a really valuable high card to play with China, given historical sensitivities.
So alliances remain key for the U.S.
Absolutely vital. Especially if the goal becomes explicit containment, allies are indispensable.
Uh,
But ultimately, the book flags the single biggest danger, the flashpoint everyone worries about: miscalculation over Taiwan.
yeah.
After seeing Beijing crack down on Hong Kong and then Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that old complacency in the U.S. about Taiwan's status quo being stable indefinitely, that's pretty much gone.
People are worried.
Very worried. Beijing used to be more patient, maybe fostering that complacency. But now, the message seems clearer. It's when, not if.
Yeah.
Watching the world react to Ukraine might make China pause, sure, but the book asks, how long does that patience last as their power grows?
It feels much more precarious now.
It really does. Confidence in the status quo is fading fast. So, understanding these distinctions, the economic entanglement, the nuclear nuances, the allies, and especially Taiwan, it's crucial for you, listening, to avoid those overly simplistic Cold War analogies and grasp the unique dangers of this era.
That comparison is incredibly clarifying. Okay, let's shift gears now and trace how this relationship actually evolved over time, starting with the American perspective. Harry Harding lays this out really well in Chapter 3.
He does. It's a great historical overview.
He walks us through about 40 years, really focusing on how U.S. policy towards China shifted and how competition gradually emerged. He starts in the 1980s, often called the Golden Era.
Right, but he adds a big asterisk to that.
He does. He says it was stable, maybe, but also fundamentally fragile. Even back then, you had these points of friction bubbling under the surface. Things like Chinese textile dumping, U.S. tech transfer restrictions, those sensitive Taiwan arms sales, even Chinese defections.
So not quite as golden as sometimes remembered.
Exactly. But Harding notes there wasn't really outright competition yet in the sense of rivals trying to undermine each other. There were still strong reasons for both sides to cooperate, like China agreeing to limit certain arms sales, and the U.S. finding ways to continue Taiwan arms sales within agreed frameworks.
Binding forces were still stronger than divisive ones.
For a time, then came the huge shocks. First, Tiananmen Square in June '89. Harding says that just shattered the relationship, and it never truly recovered its previous footing. U.S. sanctions followed.
A profound rupture.
And right on its heels, the end of the Cold War in 1991. Suddenly, the strategic rationale for cooperation against the Soviets vanished. And China. They immediately saw the U.S. differently as this democratic victor over communism and unchallenged hyperpower.
The dynamic shifted overnight.
Completely. Plus, the Gulf War showed off U.S. military might, which further fueled Chinese distrust and, Harding argues, injected this new element of competition that hadn't been there before. The Taiwan Strait crisis in 95-96 really cemented this, forcing the U.S. to plan for conflict and labeling China an emerging threat. For China's military, the PLA, stopping U.S. intervention over Taiwan became priority number one.
Laying the groundwork for future military rivalry.
Precisely. But then, through the 1990s and 2000s, we entered the engagement paradigm. This was the dominant U.S. approach.
Trying to integrate China into the system.
Right. The thinking was find stability by getting China involved in regional and global issues, and leverage China's need for U.S. markets, capital, and tech for its own development. The explicit strategy was to shape and socialize China into a constructive rising power.
The responsible stakeholder idea.
Exactly, that phrase from Robert Zoellick. The U.S. used a whole toolkit. Dialogue, building relationships, reassurance, fostering economic interdependence, setting up negotiation channels, bringing China into international organizations like the WTO.
Sounds good on paper.
But Harding offers a pretty sharp critique. He calls the engagement superficial. He argues both sides kind of kept up appearances while fundamental differences grew, and he says many Americans were never really convinced cooperation was the main story.
So the foundations were shaky.
That's his argument. He concludes it ultimately failed due to an accumulation of differences and concerns on the U.S. side combined with the arrival of U.S. President Donald Trump. He notes that while George W. Bush briefly called China a strategic competitor early on, the focus quickly shifted to counterterrorism after 9/11, giving China that breathing room.
A missed opportunity, perhaps?
So Harding seems to imply that. Which brings us to the big shift to strategic competition under Trump. Harding doesn't blame just one thing. He points to the widening power gap between the U.S. and China, the lack of a common enemy like the Soviets, and deepening clashes over values and governance. The U.S. started seeing China not just as different, but as actively challenging core American interests.
The perception fundamentally changed.
Totally. Harding actually views this whole trajectory as a kind of tragedy, where policymakers on both sides were fighting against an unavoidable fate. Looking ahead, he predicts the relationship will be this messy mix of cooperation, coexistence, competition, and confrontation, but with competition and confrontation being the dominant
A
modes.
sobering assessment.
It is, but this historical sweep really helps you understand the long-term forces that brought us here and why that shift felt almost inevitable to many in the U.S. policy world.
That U.S. perspective is absolutely crucial. But as you said, we need the other side of the story to really understand the full dynamic. Wang Jiexi's chapter provides that critical Chinese reaction.
Yes, from reluctant cooperation to assertive competition, how does Beijing see this evolution?
Well, first and foremost, from Beijing's perspective, national security is absolutely synonymous with the Communist Party's security. Xi Jinping's overall national security outlook is incredibly broad: politics, territory, military, economy, culture, tech, info, environment, you name it. But he explicitly put safeguarding national political security, especially security of the political power and system, right at the top.
So regime security is paramount.
Absolutely. Everything flows from that. And development, meaning economic growth, was the core interest for decades. China's rise depended heavily on U.S. markets, capital, technology. They called economic ties the ballast of the relationship.
But they were always wary.
Always a double-edged sword, as Wang Jiechi puts it. They benefited massively, but constantly feared the U.S. was using engagement to push Western political ideas, values, culture, essentially, promoting peaceful evolution to undermine the CPC.
That fear goes way back.
Deep-seated. And Tiananmen in 1989 was a massive turning point from their perspective, too. The CPC leadership became convinced the U.S. and the West were actively involved in stirring things up. Deng Xiaoping himself told U.S. envoys the U.S. was too deeply involved. That event cemented a deep distrust of underlying U.S. intentions.
A foundational moment of suspicion.
Definitely. Wang Jiechi then details these recurring political battles and China's consistent response patterns. Like the 2008 Lhasa riots, Beijing saw that as fueled by U.S. support for Tibetan separatists, especially after Congress honored the Dalai Lama. Or the 2010 Google incident, where Google accused China of cyber attacks and China fired back, accusing Google of working with U.S. intelligence.
So they saw these as coordinated attacks.
Yes, a clear pattern emerged in their official responses. One, any Chinese citizens involved were branded stooges. Two, these weren't seen as random events, but part of a deliberate U.S. strategy to westernize and split up China. Three, officials would deliberately ignore distinctions between U.S. government branches, media, NGOs, seeing them all as part of the plot. Four, they'd react by tightening domestic controls, new security laws, surveillance, and stepping up their own influence operations abroad.
A very specific playbook.
And of course, Taiwan remains the absolute core mission. PLA, modernization as we discussed, was overwhelmingly geared towards preventing U.S. intervention. The U.S. became the main obstacle to reunification in their eyes. So every U.S. move, arms sales, high-level visits, supportive rhetoric, just confirmed Beijing's suspicion that the U.S. intended to block reunification permanently.
It all reinforces their narrative.
Exactly. Interestingly, after 9/11, Beijing saw a strategic window of opportunity. With the U.S. bogged down in the Middle East, they felt they had maybe 20 years to focus intensely on their own development. Jiang Zemin explicitly called it Sanlu Jiyuki.
Taking advantage of U.S. distraction.
But even during that period, underlying suspicion remained. They pushed ideas like multipolarity to constrain U.S. power. Less about replacing the U.S. then, more about ensuring space for their own rise. And internally, reforms slowed, state-owned enterprises grew stronger, raising those concerns about illiberal economic policies.
Then came the financial crisis.
Right. The GFC in 2008-2009 was another huge turning point. It really shook Chinese confidence in the U.S. economic model. The narrative became, China's stimulus saved the world. Wang Xishan famously told Hank Paulson, essentially, we're not sure we should be learning from you anymore.
A major psychological shift.
Huge. And then Xi Jinping's rise from 2012 onwards really accelerated the competition. His talk of global ambitions, the China option as a development model, that more assertive wolf warrior diplomacy, his consolidation of power, it all signaled a shift to the U.S. He actively fostered domestic mistrust of the West and used China's power more aggressively abroad.
Setting the stage for the Trump-era confrontation.
Precisely. When the Trump trade war hit, Beijing framed it as a U.S. attack on the global economy. They saw tariffs and tech sanctions, especially on Huawei and ZTE, as blatant attempts to cripple their tech champions and contain China's rise. Talk of decoupling just confirmed their deepest fears.
How did they respond initially?
Their counter-strategy was described as reactive, restrained, but resourceful. Tit-for-tat tariffs, yes, but also pushing back against decoupling, trying to maintain ties. The mantra was, struggle without breaking, fight back, but don't destroy the relationship. They even adopted some U.S. demands on IP and market access into their own reform plans. She was central to navigating this.
And under Biden,
China became even firmer and more resolute, pushing back harder against U.S. attempts to compartmentalize, compete here, cooperate there. They raised specific issues like Meng Wanzhou, the U.S. one-China policy shifts, questioning if U.S. alliances were inherently anti-China.
so digging in their heels more.
Seems so. The overall Chinese view now, according to Wang Jisi, is that this competition is a long-haul venture. They expect fierce confrontation, a bumpier course, but maybe not all-out Cold War 2.0. They still want to forestall that, if possible.
Understanding that perspective is just so vital, isn't it? To see the competition from both sides. It moves you beyond those simple Western narratives.
Absolutely critical for a complete picture.
Okay, that historical context from both sides is incredibly rich. Let's pivot now to a fundamental driver you mentioned earlier, the economic origins of this rivalry. Arthur Kober's chapter tackles this head-on.
Yeah, Chapter 7, The Economic Origins of U.S.-China Strategic Competition.
He argues this big shift in U.S. policy from enabling China's rise to actively constraining it wasn't sudden. He frames it as a gradual disillusionment among U.S. political and business elites.
A slow realization that the economic relationship wasn't working out as hoped.
Exactly, a slow burn of accumulating concerns rather than a single event.
And Kroeber identifies several key economic trends that really fueled this growing disillusionment. It wasn't just one thing, it was a convergence.
Like a perfect storm brewing over years.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
First, as we touched on, China just grew way bigger and faster than almost anyone expected. Its sheer scale started altering global economics in profound ways.
It became too big to ignore or manage easily.
Right. Second, Chinese industries started competing directly with high-value U.S. industries. They weren't just making cheap toys anymore. They were climbing the value chain rapidly, becoming rivals in sectors the U.S. dominated.
Moving up the ladder.
Aggressively. Third, China's tech progress began sparking real U.S. security concerns. What looked like economic development suddenly felt like a potential strategic threat, especially with military applications.
The tech security nexus.
Exactly. Fourth, China's state-led, authoritarian capitalist model proved much more durable than many expected. It wasn't transitioning towards a market economy as hoped. Instead, it presented a persistent challenge to global systems built on different principles.
A rival model emerging.
And finally, the domestic political costs in the U.S. job losses, economic anxiety, particularly in manufacturing regions, eventually came due. The perceived downsides of China's rise created political pressure that policymakers couldn't ignore anymore.
The bill had to be paid politically.
That's a good way to put it. These 5 trends, building over time, fundamentally shifted U.S. perceptions and paved the way for a much tougher China policy.
Okay, let's unpack that point about manufacturing and job losses, because it's such a common narrative, but often oversimplified, right?
Very much so.
Yeah.
The data Kroeber presents is stark. U.S. manufacturing jobs plummeted by about 5.7 million, a third of the total, between 2000 and 2009.
Wow, that's huge. And China's WTO entry in 2001 is often blamed.
It is. But the book offers a crucial nuance, a really important corrective. It suggests that maybe 85% of those job losses were actually due to technological change automation, efficiency gains, not primarily direct import competition. Only about 15% might be attributable to imports from places like China.
That's a very different story than the one usually told.
It really is. It challenges that simple China took our jobs narrative.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean import competition had no effect, but automation was likely the much bigger factor.
So understanding that nuance is key for you, our listener, to avoid that simplistic blame game.
Definitely. And the story didn't stop there. China didn't just compete. It rapidly surpassed the U.S. in manufacturing output. By 2010, China was the world's biggest manufacturer, and by 2015, it accounted for over a quarter of global manufacturing production, way ahead of the U.S., a major shift in global industry.
And this wasn't just market magic. China's government played a heavy hand.
Oh, absolutely. The book details what it calls China's illiberal economic policies, massive subsidies to domestic firms, using anti-monopoly laws selectively against foreign companies while ignoring state monopolies, pushing specific Chinese technical standards, and crucially, those tech-focused industrial plans.
Like Made in China 2025.
Exactly. Before that, though, Intellectual property rights, IPR, was a long-running issue. China's lax enforcement, allowing knockoffs and piracy, was a major irritant for foreign firms.
But not a deal breaker initially.
For many, no. They saw the market opportunity as outweighing the risks and kept investing heavily. But Made in China 2025, launched in 2015, really changed the calculus. It felt different, more alarming.
Why specifically?
Three main reasons highlighted in the book. First, it set explicit market share targets, aiming for Chinese dominance, 40 to 70%, in key high-tech sectors, domestically and globally. Second, it was backed by absolutely massive state funding, hundreds of billions of dollars. This signaled serious intent. Third, by 2015, Chinese companies were demonstrably innovating, not just copying. The plan suddenly seemed much more credible and threatening.
So the ambition and the capability had ramped up significantly.
Precisely. And adding to the anxiety was a huge surge in Chinese direct investment into the U.S., peaking at $45 billion in 2016. This included significant venture capital in U.S. tech startups, especially in sensitive areas like AI.
Which fueled fears of technology theft.
Exactly. The suspicion grew that this wasn't just normal investment, but part of a state-coordinated plan to siphon off U.S. technology to boost China's own goals, like MIC 2025.
And the existing global rules weren't helping.
That was the growing feeling in Washington. U.S. officials became deeply skeptical that the WTO could actually restrain China's state-led practices. Cases took too long, enforcement was weak. The system felt inadequate to handle China's unique model. Understanding these specific policies, the subsidies, MIC 2025, the investment flows, the WTO limits, helps you see the concrete economic drivers behind the U.S. policy shift.
So this wasn't just about trade deficits. It was about China's whole global economic strategy, right? This outward push.
Absolutely. It went way beyond just selling goods. First, there was that intense focus on resource acquisition globally. Chinese state firms snapping up access to minerals, energy, etc.
Locking up supply.
That was the perception. Kroeber notes, many were higher-risk projects others had passed on, but the scale was concerning. Second, there was the explosion in infrastructure building by Chinese firms in developing countries. Huge projects, massive revenues, building roads, ports, dams everywhere.
And that led directly to the Belt and Road Initiative.
It did. Xi Jinping formally announced the BRI in 2013. It started focused on Asia, but quickly ballooned into this global umbrella for almost any Chinese overseas infrastructure investment. It came with dedicated funding mechanisms like the Silk Road Fund, the AIIB, where China holds the reins.
And it wasn't just about economics, was it?
No, the book is clear. There was always a significant political agenda. Use economic muscle to build geopolitical clout, promote China's state-directed development model as an alternative to Western market-led approaches. Build influence, dependency.
A tool of statecraft.
Definitely. And the Huawei case study is presented as a perfect illustration of these colliding interests: economic nationalism, national security, business.
Yeah.
The U.S. security community deeply worried about Huawei equipment, especially in 5G networks, having potential backdoors for Chinese surveillance or even sabotage in a conflict.
Yeah, that's been huge news for years.
It really crystallizes the dilemma. These examples show how China's economic activities became deeply intertwined with geopolitical ambitions, fundamentally changing how the U.S. viewed the relationship.
Given all that economic friction, what does the book suggest the U.S. should do? Does it endorse the Trump approach?
Not really. It's quite critical of what it calls the excessive, headstrong, and often harmful tactics of the Trump administration. It argues for a more nuanced strategic approach.
Okay, so what does that look like? What about the tariffs?
The book's assessment of the Trump tariffs is pretty blunt. They failed to achieve any of their aims, didn't shrink the deficit, didn't boost U.S. exports to China, didn't really revive U.S. manufacturing. The recommendation: don't just keep them indefinitely. Use them as leverage. Remove them in exchange for concrete, verifiable steps by China to reduce discrimination against foreign firms and cut subsidies.
Use them strategically, not punitively.
That's the idea. And for other tools like export controls or investment screening through FIRMA and ICARE, the advice is precision. Use them like scalpels, not meat cleavers. Target them narrowly to protect genuinely vital U.S. sectors and technologies. Don't use them broadly to try and cripple China's own development, which it sees as a fantasy anyway. Focus on building U.S. strengths.
And what about working with allies?
Crucial. The book stresses that allies, especially in Asia, simply won't sign up for U.S. strategy aimed at crushing China. Their economic ties are too deep. So multilateralism is key. Rejoining the CPTPP, the successor to TPP, would be ideal. If not politically feasible, then seriously beef up the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF, with real incentives, better market access, serious infrastructure funding. Also, create agreements with allies on rules for digital trade, tech standards to counter China's state-led model, but keep these agreements open, theoretically, to any country.
So compete smartly, multilaterally, focus on self-improvement.
That's the core message on the economic front. It offers you, the listener, a path forward that moves beyond just reacting towards a more sustainable, strategic form of competition.
Okay, let's transition now to the military side of this competition, which is obviously a huge piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
How does the U.S. military see China?
The view is clear and frankly hardening. China is seen as the primary strategic challenge, a challenge to U.S. regional dominance and to the broader U.S.-led international order.
This isn't new, but it's intensified.
Definitely. You can trace the evolution. Obama's 2011 rebalance to Asia signaled the shift. Trump's 2017 national security strategy called China a revisionist power, aiming to erode U.S. security. And the Biden administration has doubled down, calling China the most consequential strategic competitor and the pacing challenge for the Department of Defense.
Pacing challenge meaning China sets the tempo for U.S. military development.
Exactly. China's capabilities and speed of modernization are driving U.S. planning and investment. The trajectory is unambiguous. The U.S. military views China as its main long-term rival.
And from China's side, how has the PLA, their military, viewed the U.S.?
What's fascinating, as the book details, is how much the PLA's own modernization has been shaped by the U.S., seeing the U.S. both as the main threat and in some ways as the model to emulate or counter.
How so?
After Tiananmen and the Soviet collapse, China saw the U.S. as this unchallengeable hyperpower. That, plus the Taiwan issue, fueled deep suspicion about U.S. intentions. It directly sparked efforts to convert China's economic wealth into military power.
Fear drove in back.
Largely. And initially, that PLA modernization was almost laser-focused on Taiwan specifically, developing capabilities to prevent or defeat U.S. military intervention in a crisis. That focus on anti-accessoria denial, A2AD, for a Taiwan scenario really laid the foundation for their broader military buildup later on.
So Taiwan was the initial driver?
Overwhelmingly. And throughout this period, there was military-to-military diplomacy, high-level visits, dialogues, hotlines.
Did it help build trust?
Not really, according to the book. It did not generate much trust or alleviate suspicions. China pushed for a new type of military-to-military relationship, but that mostly meant the U.S. accommodating China's interests, stopped Taiwan arms sales, cut back reconnaissance flights.
Which the U.S. wasn't going to do.
Right. They got some useful confidence-building measures out of it, rules for air and sea encounters, crisis communication links, but it didn't change the fundamental competitive dynamic because neither side would budge on core interests. The trajectory towards military competition continued.
So where does that military competition stand now? What forms does it take?
The book breaks it down into several interlocking dimensions. First, it's ideological, a competition between political systems, each seeing the other as a challenge. Second, it's regional, a direct contest for influence and military dominance in the Asia-Pacific. Third, it's global, a struggle over who sets the international rules, norms, and has broader influence.
And we see concrete examples of this.
Constantly. Think about U.S. and Chinese naval patrols bumping up against each other in the South China Sea or the air intercepts. Think about the relentless conventional force modernization, both sides pouring resources into ships, planes, missiles specifically designed to counter the other, especially in a potential Taiwan conflict. And it extends to nuclear and other strategic capabilities too.
An arms race, essentially.
The book basically says yes. U.S. and Chinese weapons are increasingly designed to attack and defend against each other's systems. And their militaries are increasingly planning and training for conflicts against each other. It's a direct, focused military rivalry.
And it's moving into new domains too, right? Not just land, sea, and air.
Absolutely. Space and cyberspace are huge. China explicitly called them new commanding heights in strategic competition back in 2015.
What are they doing there?
China's developing anti-satellite, ASIC weapons, partly because they see the U.S. military as highly dependent on space assets. Both sides are massively investing in space-based ISR intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, plus communications, navigation like GPS Beidou. The creation of China's Strategic Support Force and the U.S. Space Force just highlights how intense and costly this space race is.
And cyber.
That seemed to be an offense-dominant domain. The book notes China's impressive capability to penetrate U.S. networks, military, government, defense contractors. The U.S., of course, has its own very significant cyber capabilities for intelligence and attack. Many emerging U.S. military concepts rely heavily on cyber and electronic warfare to disrupt Chinese systems in a conflict.
What about AI? That's everywhere now.
Another critical frontier, artificial intelligence and autonomous weapons. The U.S. started pushing for a third offset strategy using AI under Obama. China has its own hugely ambitious AI development plan aiming for global leadership by 2030. The PLA is actively exploring military uses, talking about a shift to intelligentized warfare.
Wars fought partly by machines.
That's the direction things could be heading. Scary stuff. And all this plays out within complex regional dynamics. The Indo-Pacific is ground zero. U.S. allies willing to host bases are the U.S. strategic center of gravity. But China's economic pull makes it hard for regional countries to choose sides. Add in wildcards like North Korea, or the impact of the Ukraine war potentially pushing Europe closer to the U.S. stance on China. It's incredibly complex.
Really shows you how technology is reshaping everything.
Fundamentally, it's a whole new era of military competition.
You mentioned regional dynamics. Does China have any specific advantages there, playing on its home turf, so to speak?
It does. The book points out a key home field advantage. Unlike the U.S., which has global commitments, Europe, Middle East, etc., China, at least until recently, could focus its resources much more narrowly on the Western Pacific.
A prioritized asymmetry.
Exactly. It allows for more concentrated effort and investment in its immediate neighborhood, even as its global reach grows. Secondly, China can rely on the strategic depth of its homeland for support. It could launch missiles, deploy aircraft from mainland bases relatively easily.
Whereas the U.S. relies on forward bases.
Right. The U.S. depends heavily on allied territory, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, first island chain, or more distant bases like Guam. This makes U.S. operations logistically more complex and politically sensitive.
But it also makes China's homeland a potential target.
That's the flip side, yes. Relying on homeland depth means your own cities and industries could be vulnerable in a major conventional war. But still, that ability to concentrate resources regionally and operate from secure home bases gives China significant advantages in its near seas. It's a key factor for you to consider when thinking about the regional military balance.
Okay, let's shift again to something maybe less visible but incredibly important. This whole area of non-traditional security, especially economic espionage and technology transfer.
Yeah, this is a huge focus in the book and in real-world policy debates.
The FBI quote cited is pretty stark, calling the threat from China the greatest long-term threat to U.S. information IP and economic vitality.
It sets the tone. And the primary channel for this, not surprisingly, is cyber. The big wake-up call was Operation Aurora back in 2009-2010, targeting Google and other tech giants.
Why was that such a big deal?
Because it shifted from typical state-on-state spying on government or military targets to directly hitting private companies for commercial and technological advantage. It felt like a crossing of the line, directly threatening U.S. economic competitiveness.
But it's not just cyber hacking, is it?
Not at all. The book details what U.S. officials call non-traditional collection. A whole suite of methods, often legal or quasi-legal on the surface, aimed squarely at acquiring technology to fuel China's industrial policies.
Like what kind of methods?
Well, talent recruitment programs are a big one.
Yeah.
Things like the 1,000 Talents program. China is actively, systematically recruiting top engineers and scientists from around the world, including from U.S. universities, labs, companies, even defense contractors.
Offering big incentives.
Huge incentives. Then there's academic collaboration, seen increasingly as a channel for tech transfer, where joint research projects can inadvertently or deliberately funnel sensitive knowledge back to China. Also, supply chain access. The idea is that through its deep ties with subcontractors and suppliers, the Chinese government might get a better understanding of, say, the U.S. defense supply chain than the Pentagon itself does through its prime contractors.
Finding vulnerabilities deep in the chain.
Exactly. And the ultimate goal, as one U.S. official put it bluntly, is to rob the American company of its intellectual property, replicate the technology, and replace the American company in the Chinese market, and one day, the global market.
Wow, that's a chilling summary.
It is. It really helps you understand that this goes way beyond James Bond-style spying. It's a broad, systematic national strategy to acquire technological advantage through multiple means.
This obviously leads into the controversy around the U.S. Justice Department's China initiative. The book addresses this directly.
It does, and it tries to separate myth from reality, which is really important given how politicized this became.
Okay, what are the key myths it tackles?
First, the myth that China's efforts are just like any other country's efforts to attract talent and tech. The book argues no, the scope and scale of China's government-run foreign technology acquisition effort are unprecedented in human history. Hundreds of programs, billions of dollars, it's just on a different level.
So scale makes it qualitatively different.
That's the argument. Second, the myth that it was a racist initiative targeting people based on ethnicity. The book presents data showing nationality, not ethnicity, is the key explanatory variable. People indicted or convicted for economic espionage benefiting China were overwhelmingly PRC nationals or naturalized U.S. citizens, originally from the PRC. The data points to state ties, not race.
A crucial distinction.
Very. Third, the myth that it started by focusing on minor research grant disclosure issues. The reality, according to the book, is that focus evolved after authorities found hard data downloaded from Chinese websites showing hundreds of U.S. federal grant recipients had also received undisclosed money from Chinese talent programs. That discovery shifted the focus towards research integrity.
So the focus followed the evidence trail.
That's how it was presented. And it's important to note the China Initiative name was formally dropped in early 2022 due to concerns about chilling scientific collaboration and potential profiling.
So it ended.
The name ended. But the book points out that its main features will continue apace under a broader strategy for countering nation-state threats. The Assistant Attorney General explicitly said China remains the top priority because its government stands apart in the threat it poses through espionage, IP theft, cyber attacks, etc.
So the focus remains just under a different banner.
It seems to be the case. And as a concrete example of U.S. pushback, the book mentions the closure of the Houston consulate in 2020. The U.S. cited malign and criminal activities, linking consulate officials to S&T espionage, including against COVID vaccine research, and also to China's Operation Fox Hunt, which allegedly involved teams trying to coerce or kidnap dissidents on U.S. soil.
Pretty serious allegations.
Very. This section really helps you, our listener, navigate a very complex and controversial policy area, trying to separate the documented activities from the political rhetoric surrounding the response.
And all these collection efforts, these countermeasures, they fit into a larger Chinese strategy, don't they? Xi Jinping's vision.
Absolutely. The book argues Xi has been systematically building a techno-security state. This means two key things. Integrating civilian tech advances directly into military applications, that's military-civil fusion, and using technology aggressively for internal security and social control, often called digital authoritarianism.
A top-down, state-driven approach to tech and security.
Exactly. And it's backed by serious bureaucratic reorganization. They set up powerful central bodies, like the Central Commission for Cybersecurity and Informatization, overseeing everything from the digital economy to network security. This body drove the controversial 2017 cybersecurity law, which worried foreign companies due to requirements for source code disclosure, data localization, etc., giving the state potentially huge access.
What about funding this ambition, especially in critical areas like semiconductors?
That led to the National IC Investment Fund, the Mother Fund, created in 2014, a massive state-backed fund, pooling billions to try and break China's reliance on foreign chips. Early attempts by this fund to buy U.S. semiconductor firms like Micron immediately set off alarm bells in Washington and triggered a crackdown using CFI-US, the Investment Review Committee. It looked like a clear attempt to use state capital to acquire critical tech.
And Made in China 2025 is the centerpiece of this whole strategy.
It really is. That MIC 2025 blueprint from 2015 lays out the plan for China to become a leader in advanced manufacturing by 2025. Hitting specific domestic content targets, like 70% self-sufficiency in core components. The ultimate goal is reducing reliance on foreign tech, especially in strategic sectors like chips.
And this even spills over into financial markets.
It does. The threat of delisting Chinese firms from U.S. stock exchanges due to long-standing disputes over auditing transparency. Beijing blocking U.S. regulators from inspecting audits properly is another pressure point. It forced many Chinese tech giants to seek secondary listings in Hong Kong and highlights how financial markets are now intertwined with these tech and security tensions. Beijing worries delisting could hurt its S&T development.
It really shows you the sheer scale and integration of China's strategy. Tech, security, economy, military, it's all connected.
A truly comprehensive, state-directed effort.
Okay, we've covered the history, the economics, the military, the tech transfer. Let's look towards the future now, as the book does in its final section. How do experts think about forecasting where this is all heading?
Well, David Edelstein's chapter offers a really interesting framework based on time horizons. how perceptions of the future shape decisions now.
Time horizons, how does that work?
He talks about the dilemmas faced by both declining and rising powers. For a declining power, let's say arguably the U.S. in relative terms, the dilemma is, do you act now to curb the growth of a rising power like China, whose future intentions are uncertain? Or do you wait and see, hoping their ambitions aren't hostile?
Act preemptively or wait for clarity.
Right. And interestingly, Edelstein argues that uncertainty sometimes actually encourages cooperation in the short term, because acting on worst-case fears is really costly. If you're not sure, maybe you wait. It's premature certainty about hostile intentions that often leads to conflict.
That's counterintuitive.
It is. And for the rising power, like China, the dilemma is, do you assert your new interests forcefully now, or wait until you're even stronger?
Strike while the iron's hot, or be patient.
Exactly. And the book suggests rising powers often benefit from patience. Avoid provoking a backlash too early. Cooperation can fuel your growth. Maintain some ambiguity. When they do expand interests, they often prefer salami tactics, small, incremental steps that don't trigger a massive response, because they believe time is on their side.
Taking one slice at a time.
Precisely. This whole time horizon framework gives you a lens to understand the underlying strategic calculations, the push and pull between acting now versus waiting, that influences both Washington's and Beijing's behavior.
That's a fascinating way to think about it. Now, David Shambaugh offers a different framing, calling the current situation Cold War 1.5. What does he mean by that?
He's arguing it's not quite a full repeat of the U.S.-Soviet Cold War 2.0, but something distinct. He differentiates between hard rivalry and soft rivalry.
Okay, what's the difference?
Hard rivalry has clear action-reaction dynamics. It's inherently zero-sum. He puts political competition, some societal aspects, and definitely military competition in this category. One side's gain is the other's loss.
Direct confrontation.
Pretty much. Soft rivalry is more subtle. Each side pursues its own interests, but they're constantly carefully monitoring the other. Left direct clash, more parallel paths with mutual suspicion. He includes bureaucratic competition, the regional competition in Asia, and global governance struggles here.
So different levels of intensity across different areas.
Exactly. And he points to tangible signs of this rivalry playing out, like institutional decoupling agreements not being renewed, dialogues being canceled, the Trump administration killing the big strategic and economic dialogue, S&ED, is a prime example. They saw it as a trap, while China typically loves dialogues.
A U.S. move away from engagement structures.
Right. Then there's the intense media competition. U.S. media facing huge restrictions in China, while China pours money into its great external propaganda efforts in the U.S. Trump labeling Chinese state media as foreign missions, leading to tit-for-tat journalist expulsions. Although Biden negotiates some easing of that.
A war of narratives.
Very much so. The Asian regional competition is described as the absolute epicenter. U.S. deployments, reconnaissance flights, Taiwan aid, all huge neuralgic concerns for China. U.S. strategy from Obama's pivot to Trump's free and open Indo-Pacific to Biden's focus aims to constrain China regionally. It's an intense ongoing struggle.
And globally.
In global governance, Washington increasingly sees Beijing as revisionist, trying to undermine the existing liberal order. China's new institutions, BRI, AIIB, SAQ, are viewed by the U.S. as tools to expand influence. China naturally frames them as new type of cooperative diplomacy. Two totally different narratives about shaping the world order. Shambaugh's breakdown really shows you the day-to-day reality of this competition across so many different fronts.
So, given all this complexity and uncertainty, how does the book's editor, Evan Medeiros, characterize the relationship today in the concluding chapter?
He highlights three core features. It's rapidly evolving, highly uncertain, and increasingly complex. These are the defining characteristics right now.
And what's driving this?
A huge factor is domestic politics in both countries. In China, you have soaring nationalism, official confidence in their own system, whole process democracy, sharp critiques of Western liberalism, and that assertive wolf warrior diplomacy encouraged by Xi. His whole national security perspective sees U.S. policies as threats to the CPC's legitimacy. This fuels calls for self-reliance, reducing dependence on the West, especially after seeing sanctions on Russia. And decisions are highly centralized around Xi.
And in the U.S.
You have that hardening bipartisan consensus for a tough China stance. Very rare these days. Medeiros warns that domestic forces in both countries can have a particularly harmful influence, spreading misinformation, pushing worst-case thinking, advocating hard lines. This internal dynamic makes finding stability really difficult.
It's a feedback loop.
Exactly. And then there's the intensifying complexity. On one hand, the connections are still incredibly deep: trade, finance, research, global issues. Interdependence is real, even if downplayed. But on the other hand, the sources of competition are just multiplying: security, economics, tech, fundamental ideas about governance. Policymakers seem more willing to tolerate friction, pursue confrontation, and there's very little sustained cooperation to balance it out.
Pulling in opposite directions simultaneously.
Precisely. A very precarious balance.
So, for you, our listener, trying to make sense of where this might go, Medeiros identifies 3 critical variables to watch. 3 things that will really shape the future trajectory. What are they?
First, ideological competition. It's becoming undeniable. The rivalry is increasingly framed in terms of values, governance models. Each side sees the other as an ideological threat. This feeds nationalism on both sides and makes compromise harder.
The battle of ideas.
Yes. Second, and he calls this absolutely critical, is the Taiwan issue. How this is managed will be dispositive for the future of the relationship. Poor handling leads straight to highly militarized competition, maybe even conflict.
The ultimate flashpoint.
It is, and the trends are worrying. Perceptions hardening in Beijing, Taipei, and Washington. Military buildups accelerating. It's becoming a global issue, drawing in Europe and others. And most ominously, he says, the nuclear shadow is beginning to cast its pall as China modernizes its nuclear forces. The stakes around Taiwan are getting incredibly high.
That's deeply concerning. What's the third variable?
Economics.
Sure.
Specifically, the future structure of the global economy and China's own growth prospects. Will global trends push towards more competition or cooperation? Events like the pandemic and Ukraine war are already making countries rethink supply chains, prioritizing security and redundancy over pure efficiency, maybe moving away from reliance on China.
Reshoring, friendshoring.
Exactly. And China itself faces huge internal pressures trying to become more self-reliant, but also facing major demographic headwinds: shrinking workforce, aging population that could limit growth. Will Xi prioritize geopolitical ambition over domestic prosperity if growth slows? That's a huge question.
Ideology, Taiwan, economics, those are the key signposts to watch.
According to Medeiros, yes, they will heavily influence which path the relationship takes.
And what are the possible paths, the future scenarios the book outlines? Is it inevitably Cold War 2.0 or worse?
The book explores several possibilities, but stresses none are inevitable. Agency and unexpected events matter hugely. One scenario is stable strategic competition. This is seen as perhaps the most likely, but it requires real caution, restraint, and political space for leaders on both sides to manage tensions without escalating.
Manageable rivalry.
Hopefully. Another is détente, like the U.S.-Soviet experience. But the book suggests this would likely require a major shock, a near-war crisis like the Cuban Missile Crisis that scares everyone straight, or maybe prolonged Chinese economic austerity that forces Beijing to fundamentally change course. Seems unlikely in the near term without a shock.
What about actual war?
A hot war isn't detailed as a specific scenario outcome, but it looms constantly as the ultimate danger, the shadow. Miscalculation is always the risk.
And the new Cold War.
That scenario is also explored. It would likely involve limited decoupling, parallel supply chains, separate tech ecosystems, a U.S.-led one and a China-led one, and clearer global alignments, maybe China, Russia versus U.S. and allies, plus competition for influence in the global south, a divided world.
So, several possibilities, none guaranteed.
Exactly. The book's final message really emphasizes agency and contingency. Leaders' choices matter immensely. Xi's moves in the South China Sea, Trump's trade war decisions like these can destabilize things. But decisions can also stabilize. And unexpected events, a pandemic, a regional crisis can throw everything off course.
The future isn't written yet?
Not at all. But the underlying dynamics are clear. Both the U.S. and China are more ambitious, more capable. Military competition, especially around Taiwan, is intensifying. Domestic politics are pushing towards confrontation. While allies might prefer stability, the overall trajectory is towards deeper, more complex, and potentially more dangerous competition. Human choices will determine how it plays out.
Wow. We have certainly covered a huge amount of ground today, haven't we?
We really have. It's a complex book covering a complex relationship.
Absolutely. From defining competition itself, tracing those historical paths through both U.S. and Chinese eyes, diving deep into the economic, military, and tech battlegrounds.
Exploring non-traditional security and peering into those possible future scenarios.
Cold Rivals really does give you, our listener, this critical, multi-layered understanding of what is, without doubt, one of the most defining relationships of our era. And the key takeaway, I think, is that Understanding the nuances, getting beyond those simple headlines, is just crucial for navigating the world we live in.
Couldn't agree more.
So as we wrap up, here's a final thought to leave you with, something the book prompts us to consider.
Okay?
It highlights repeatedly that both the US and China are more ambitious, more capable than ever. But given how deeply intertwined their economies still are, and how this rivalry is increasingly framed in ideological terms, can either side really achieve total self-reliance or complete decoupling without massively harming their own prosperity and stability?
That's the trillion-dollar question, isn't it?
Or are they just stuck, maybe, in this shared, intensely competitive future? And looking ahead, what do you think is the single most significant factor? Maybe a policy change, a tech breakthrough, an unexpected crisis that could genuinely de-escalate things, or conversely, push this rivalry towards an even more dangerous phase in the coming years.
A lot to think about there. No easy answers.
Definitely not. A lot to chew on. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into cold rivals.
Thank you for listening.
We truly hope you found it enlightening, maybe sparked some new thinking. Keep nurturing that curiosity, keep asking critical